November 19th, 1256. Diz Fortress, northern Persia. The wind cuts across the mountain peaks like a blade. 26-year-old Rukn al-Din Kursha stands alone on the eastern rampart, his hands gripping the cold stone battlements. Below him, the valley spreads out in all directions, and covering that valley, stretching from horizon to horizon, is an army. Not just any army. 138,000 Mongol warriors. Their campfires number in the thousands. Smoke rises from cooking fires, from forge fires, from the massive siege engines that have been hammering these walls for weeks. The sound carries up the cliff face. Horses neighing, metal striking metal. Orders being shouted in a language Rukn al-Din doesn't speak, but has learned to fear. He can see the trebuchets, 12 of them. Enormous wooden structures built by Chinese engineers who traveled 2 years across the Asian continent for this single purpose, to break these walls. Walls that have never fallen. Walls built by his ancestors 166 years ago. The walls are cracking. Behind him, inside the fortress, 138 people remain. Warriors, yes, but also their wives, their children. 47 children under the age of 12. He can hear one of them crying right now. Hunger. They've been eating half rations for 3 weeks. The food will run out in 72 hours. The water will last longer. Alamut has an independent well, fed by an underground spring. But you can't survive on water alone. Rukn al-Din closes his eyes. When he opens them, he forces himself to look at the reality below, to count the enemy, to calculate the impossible mathematics of survival. 138 defenders. 138,000 attackers, 1,000 to 1. His advisors have presented him with 3 options, only 3. Because in war, when you're surrounded, when you're outnumbered, when the world's most efficient killing machine has you in its grip, options narrow quickly. Option 1. Fight to the death. Preserve honor. Every man on the walls until the end. The Mongols will breach the fortress eventually. They always do. And when they do, everyone inside dies. The warriors die fighting. The women die. The children die. But at least they die with honor. At least the songs will remember them. Option 2. Surrender. Open the gates. Hope the Mongol commander Hulagu Khan keeps his promise of mercy. Walk out unarmed. Trust that 166 years of history, 166 years of making empires think twice before attacking, will mean something. Trust that your surrender will save the women and children, even if the warriors must die. Option 3. There is no option 3. His military commander suggested a breakout, a desperate nighttime run through Mongol lines. He calculated 40% of them might escape. Rukn al-Din calculated what 40% survival means. It means 60% death. It means choosing which children live and which children die. He rejected option 3. So, 2 choices, both terrible. He is barely past his mid-20s. He has been the leader of his people for 11 months. His father died last December in circumstances still whispered about in dark corners. Some say natural causes. Some say poison. Some say betrayal from within. Rukn al-Din doesn't know the truth, but he knows this. His father left him with an impossible inheritance. The weight of 100 fortresses, the weight of tens of thousands of lives, the weight of decisions that kings twice his age would struggle to make. And now, standing on these walls, watching the sun set behind the Mongol siege engines, he must decide, if you were in your mid-20s, if 138 people inside the fortress were looking to you for answers, if 100,000 more people in 100 other fortresses across Persia were counting on your leadership, if every choice led to tragedy, what would you do? Hold that question. Because to understand why this moment matters, why one decision on a mountaintop in Persia would echo through 770 years of history, we need to go back, 166 years back, to the year 1090, to a 40-year-old Persian scholar named Hassan-i-Sabbah, and to a problem that seemed impossible to solve. The Seljuk Empire controlled Persia in 1090, a vast Sunni Muslim empire ruled through military might and political calculation. And within that empire there existed a small religious minority called the Ismailis, a branch of Shia Islam. Different theology, different leadership, different enough to be dangerous. The Seljuks didn't tolerate differences. Hassan-i-Sabbah was an Ismaili scholar, educated, brilliant, a theologian, a mathematician, a strategist. He traveled extensively throughout the Islamic world, studying, teaching, debating. And everywhere he went, he saw the same pattern: persecution, Ismaili communities harassed, Ismaili leaders arrested, Ismaili mosques burned. The Seljuk policy was simple: convert to mainstream Sunni Islam, leave or die. For most minorities facing this situation, the math is brutal. You have no army. The empire has hundreds of thousands of soldiers. You have no territory. The empire controls everything from the Mediterranean to Central Asia. You have no allies. Everyone fears the Seljuk military machine. The conventional answer: you lose. You disappear. You become a footnote in history. Hassan-i-Sabbah refused to accept that answer. He was 40 years old in 1090, old enough to understand the world doesn't give you what you deserve, it gives you what you can take and hold. Young enough to believe that a small group of committed people could change the mathematics of power. Hassan understood something fundamental about warfare, something that military academies would spend the next 9 centuries rediscovering. You don't need to defeat your enemy on the battlefield if you can make fighting you too expensive to be worth it. Asymmetric warfare, that's what we call it now. The strategy of the weak against the strong. The strategy of making every attack cost more than it's worth. But first, he needed a fortress. Somewhere the Seljuk army couldn't easily reach. Somewhere defensible. Somewhere that could become the foundation of something new. He found it in the Alborz Mountains of northern Persia. Alamut, the eagle's nest. Picture this: a rock outcropping rising 200 meters straight up from the valley floor, sheer cliffs on 3 sides, a single narrow path winding up the eastern approach, barely wide enough for 2 men to walk side by side. At the top, a fortress, stone walls, towers, an independent water supply fed by underground springs, storage rooms carved into the rock itself, capable of holding supplies for years. Militarily, it was perfect. An army could march into that valley with 50,000 men and still struggle to take Alamut. The approach path was a killing ground. Siege engines couldn't get the angle. Starvation wouldn't work because of the water and storage. There was just one problem: someone else owned it. A Seljuk administrator named Mahdi, loyal to the empire, protected by Seljuk law and Seljuk soldiers. Hassan-i-Sabbah didn't attack with an army. He couldn't. He didn't have an army. Instead, he came to the Alamut Valley as a teacher. This is important. This is the difference between a warlord and a strategist. A warlord sees a fortress and thinks about siege engines. A strategist sees a fortress and thinks about the people inside it. Hassan spent months in the valley, maybe years. The historical sources aren't clear on the timeline, but they're clear on the method. He taught. He preached. He helped the villagers. He explained Ismaili theology in ways that made sense to common people. He didn't threaten. He didn't coerce. He persuaded. Gradually, the villagers converted. Then the guards, then the servants inside the fortress itself. And one day in 1090, the gates of Alamut opened. No battle, no siege, no blood. Hassan-i-Sabbah walked in and took control of the most strategically valuable fortress in northern Persia without killing a single person. Legend says he even paid the previous owner, Mahdi, 3,000 gold dinars. As if this were a normal business transaction. As if he had purchased a house instead of seizing the foundation of a revolution. This was the first victory. And it teaches us something crucial about power. Sometimes intelligence defeats strength. Sometimes patience defeats violence. Sometimes the fortress that cannot be taken by force can be opened from the inside through persuasion. But Hassan knew that one fortress wasn't enough. The Seljuks would come, eventually. They couldn't allow an independent Ismaili stronghold in their territory. They would send an army. And yes, Alamut could withstand a siege, but sieges end. Either the fortress falls or the besieging army gives up. And the Seljuks didn't give up. Hassan needed a strategy, a way to make the Seljuks think twice, a way to ensure that attacking Ismaili communities came with a price so high that even emperors would hesitate. He developed that strategy over the next 2 years, and in 1092, the world learned what it meant. Nizam al-Mulk was the Grand Vizier of the Seljuk Empire, the power behind the throne. The architect of Seljuk policy for 3 decades, a brilliant administrator, a ruthless politician, and the driving force behind the anti-Ismaili campaign. Under his direction, Ismaili communities throughout Persia had been systematically targeted, mosques destroyed, leaders executed, communities scattered. Nizam al-Mulk was the reason Hassan-i-Sabah had to build Alamut in the first place. October 14th, 1092, Nizam al-Mulk was traveling from Isfahan to Baghdad, a routine journey. He was 73 years old, the most powerful man in the Seljuk Empire after the Sultan himself, protected by bodyguards, surrounded by servants and officials. He stopped at a caravanserai for the night. After evening prayers, he was walking to his quarters when a man approached, dressed as a Sufi mystic, a common sight in Persia. Religious wanderers were everywhere. The man appeared to be asking for a blessing. He got close, very close, and then in a single motion he drew a knife and plunged it into Nizam al-Mulk's chest. The Grand Vizier of the Seljuk Empire died within minutes, surrounded by bodyguards who couldn't prevent it, protected by walls and soldiers who arrived too late. The assassin didn't try to escape. He was killed immediately, but he accomplished his mission. And across Persia, across the Islamic world, everyone understood the message. The Ismailis could reach anyone, anywhere, anytime. Now, there's a debate we need to have here, a debate that's raged for 900 years and will probably rage for 900 more. Was this terrorism, or was it warfare? Some historians call Hassan-i-Sabah the father of terrorism. They point to the targeting of civilians, of political leaders, of people who were killed not on battlefields but in their homes, in caravanserais, in mosques. Other historians call it asymmetric warfare, the only strategy available to a persecuted minority with no army, no territory, no conventional military power. They point out that every target was carefully chosen. Every assassination had a clear political purpose. This wasn't random violence. This was calculated strategy. The truth is complicated. It usually is. Hassan's fighters, called fidayin, those willing to sacrifice, weren't mindless fanatics. They were highly trained, highly disciplined. They studied their targets for months, sometimes years. They learned languages. They adopted disguises. They infiltrated courts and governments and military headquarters. And they killed with precision, not random civilians, not symbolic targets. They killed the specific individuals who posed the greatest threat to Ismaili communities, military commanders planning campaigns against Ismaili fortresses, government officials ordering persecution, religious leaders calling for Ismaili extermination. Each assassination was a message. If you threaten us, you personally are at risk. Not your armies, not your subjects, you. And here's the thing about that strategy. It worked. For 166 years, it worked. The Seljuk Empire continued to exist. The Abbasid Caliphate continued to rule. Crusader kingdoms continued to fight. But none of them could eliminate the Ismailis. Because every sultan, every caliph, every king had to calculate, is it worth it? Is attacking the Ismailis worth the risk of waking up one morning to find a dagger next to my pillow? A message that says, "We could have killed you. This time we didn't. Next time we might." The psychological impact was enormous. Stories spread. Legends grew. Some were true. Most were exaggerated. But they all served the same purpose. They made people afraid. Stories of Fedayeen infiltrating the most secure palaces in the world. Stories of assassinations that seemed impossible. Stories of Ismaili agents embedded so deep in foreign governments that they could hear the Sultan's private conversations. The most famous legend involved Saladin, the hero of the Islamic world, the general who reconquered Jerusalem from the Crusaders, the man who united the fractured Muslim kingdoms into a coherent force. Even Saladin feared the assassins. Twice they came for him. Twice he survived by luck rather than skill. After the second attempt, Saladin reached a peace agreement with the Ismailis. He left them alone. They left him alone. If Saladin couldn't defeat them, who could? Over the next century and a half, Hassan-i-Sabbah's vision became reality. The Ismailis built or captured over 100 fortresses throughout Persia and Syria. Each fortress was chosen for specific strategic reasons: high elevation, difficult terrain, independent water sources, storage capacity for years of siege, interlocking fields of fire for defensive positions. These weren't random castles. This was a network, a distributed system designed to survive even if individual nodes fell. Alamut became more than a military headquarters. It became a center of learning. Hassan built a massive library there. Some sources claim 400,000 volumes. Modern historians are skeptical of that number. 400,000 books would have been an enormous collection, even for the greatest universities of the era. But even if the real number was 1/10 of that, even if it was 40,000 volumes, that's still remarkable. This wasn't just a military organization. This was a cultural center. Scholars came to Alamut to study astronomy, mathematics, philosophy, medicine. The Ismailis preserved texts that would have been lost otherwise. They translated Greek and Persian works into Arabic. They contributed to the Islamic Golden Age even as they fought for survival within it. And yes, they also trained assassins. The list of people they killed reads like a medieval history textbook. 2 Abbasid caliphs, dozens of Seljuk officials and military commanders, Conrad of Montferrat, who was about to become king of Jerusalem, numerous governors and administrators throughout Persia and Syria. Each death served a purpose. Each assassination protected Ismaili communities from those who threatened them. This is asymmetric warfare in its purest form. When you can't defeat your opponent on the battlefield, you change the battlefield. When you can't match their armies, you target their leaders. When you can't survive through conventional means, you make unconventional means work. For 166 years, this strategy kept the Ismailis alive in a world that wanted them dead. Until they met an opponent who played by completely different rules. An opponent who didn't fear assassination, who didn't negotiate, who didn't calculate costs and benefits. An opponent who only understood one language: total war. While Hassan-i-Sabbah was building his shadow empire in Persia, far to the east, another kind of power was forming. Genghis Khan had unified the Mongol tribes and created what historians would later call the perfect war machine. But Genghis died in 1227. His empire passed to his sons and grandsons. By 1251, one of those grandsons, Möngke Khan, sat on the throne of the largest land empire in human history, stretching from Korea to Poland, from Siberia to the borders of India. And Möngke looked at the map and saw 2 remaining obstacles to complete control of Western Asia: the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, the spiritual center of the Islamic world, and the Nizari Ismaili fortresses scattered throughout Persia, places that had given every previous empire headaches, places that assassination couldn't conquer because the Mongols didn't fear assassination, places that negotiation couldn't subdue Because the Mongols didn't negotiate. Möngke gave the mission to his brother, Hulagu Khan. Not because Hulagu was the most brutal Mongol commander, there were plenty of those, because Hulagu was the best organizer. In October 1253, Hulagu left Karakoram, the Mongol capital, thousands of miles to the east, with an army unlike any that had marched before, 138,000 warriors, but not just cavalry, not just the horse archers that made the Mongols famous. Hulagu brought 1,000 teams of Chinese engineers, 1,000 teams. These weren't soldiers, these were specialists. Siege warfare experts, trebuchet designers, men who understood mathematics and physics and how to break stone walls with wood and rope and counterweights. This is the key difference between Hulagu's campaign and every previous attempt to destroy the Nizari Ismailis. Previous empires sent armies that could defeat other armies on battlefields, but armies that broke against mountain fortresses. Hulagu brought technology. The Mongols had learned their lesson from China. Cavalry can sweep across open plains and destroy enemy formations, but cavalry can't ride up sheer cliffs. Cavalry can't knock down stone walls 30 feet thick. For that you need machines, and engineers who know how to build them. The massive host moved slowly. It took 2 full years to travel from Mongolia to Persia, but everywhere they went, they consolidated power, they summoned local lords, they demanded troops and supplies and intelligence. This wasn't a raid. This wasn't a quick strike. This was a meticulously planned campaign with perfect logistics aimed at a single goal: complete elimination of the Nizari Ismailis. And somewhere in Alamut, in the fortress that had stood unconquered for 166 years, Hassan-i Saba's successors watched reports coming in from their intelligence network, and they understood. Everything was about to change. The question was, could they stop it? Could the strategy that had worked for 166 years work one more time? Could assassination reach far enough, strike hard enough, to stop the Mongol war machine before it reached Persia? They were about to find out. And the answer would be written in blood and fire across the mountains of northern Persia. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. We're still in 1253, still 2 years before Hulagu crosses into Persia. Still 3 years before that November day when the young Grand Master stands on the walls of Mehmed-Diz, watching the sun set over the Mongol army, trying to decide between 2 terrible choices. We need to understand what happened in those 3 years. We need to understand the desperation, the gambles, the impossible decisions that led to that moment, because that's where the story gets interesting. That's where we learn what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object. That's where we learn what happens when the perfect war machine comes for the world's deadliest assassins. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. Where in the world are you watching this from? What time is it for you right now? Drop a comment below. I'm genuinely curious who's following this story and from what time zones. There's something powerful about people across the globe, centuries later, contemplating the same impossible choice that Rukn al-Din faced. The decision between honor and hope, between certain death and desperate gamble. Now, back to 1253, and the most audacious assassination attempt in history. For 166 years, the Nizari Ismailis had survived against impossible odds. A small religious minority within Shia Islam, persecuted by the vast Sunni Seljuk Empire, they had developed a strategy that made empires think twice before attacking them. Asymmetric warfare, targeted assassination of political leaders, a network of mountain fortresses scattered across Persia and Syria, with Alamut, the Eagle's Nest, as their headquarters. Founded in 1090 by Hassan-i Sabah, a brilliant 40-year-old scholar who captured Alamut through persuasion rather than siege, the Nizaris had built something unprecedented. Not an army, not a kingdom, but a system of deterrence. You persecute us, your leaders die. Simple, brutal, effective. For 166 years, it worked against the Seljuks. Against the Abbasid Caliphate, against Crusader kingdoms, even against Saladin, hero of the Islamic world, who survived 2 assassination attempts and decided peace was wiser than war. But in 1253 they faced an enemy who didn't fear assassination, the Mongols. And in 1253, while Hulagu Khan's army, accompanied by 1,000 Chinese siege engineers, was still marching westward across the steppes of Central Asia, the Nizari Ismaili leadership gathered in Alamut to discuss their options. They weren't fools. Their intelligence network was extensive. Merchants traveling the Silk Road, agents embedded in foreign courts, informants in every major city between Mongolia and the Mediterranean. They knew Hulagu was coming. They knew the size of his army. They knew about the Chinese engineers. And they knew that if they let Hulagu reach Persia with his full strength, they would lose. The fortress system that had protected them for 166 years was designed to withstand conventional sieges, stone walls, mountain positions, years of stored supplies. These defenses worked against armies that eventually had to give up and go home. But the Mongols didn't go home. The Mongols had just spent 30 years conquering China. They knew how to break fortresses. They knew how to sustain sieges for years if necessary. They had the patience. They had the resources. They had the technology. So the Nizari leadership asked themselves a question. What if we don't let them reach Persia at all? What if we strike first? What if we cut the head off the snake before it arrives? The plan they developed was audacious. Some would say insane. Assassinate Möngke Khan, the great Khan of the Mongol Empire, in Karakorum, in the heart of Mongol territory, surrounded by the most elite bodyguards in the world. If it worked, Hulagu would have to turn back. The Mongol Empire would descend into succession crisis, different princes fighting over the throne. The campaign against Persia would collapse before it began. If it failed, well, the consequences of failure didn't bear thinking about. 400 men were chosen, not the entire Fedayeen force. The Nizaris still needed warriors to defend the fortresses, but 400 of their best. 400 men willing to travel 1,000 miles into enemy territory for a mission that would almost certainly end in death. Even if they succeeded, even if they killed Möngke Khan. Most of them wouldn't make it home. They knew this. They went anyway. That's what Fedayeen means, those willing to sacrifice. The preparation took months. Each man needed a cover identity: merchant, pilgrim, scholar, craftsman. They needed trade goods. They needed languages. Some of them learned Mongolian. Others learned Chinese. They needed to look like they belonged on the Silk Road. They traveled in small groups, 5 men here, 10 men there, never large enough to attract attention. They carried knives hidden in their belongings, poison in sealed containers, instructions memorized, never written down. The journey took half a year, 1,000 miles from the mountains of Persia to the steppes of Mongolia, through cities where Mongol officials checked papers and asked questions, through checkpoints where guards searched baggage. 400 men making that journey, all converging on a single destination: Karakorum. Think about what that means. Think about the logistics, the coordination, the discipline required. This wasn't a suicide attack by fanatics throwing themselves at the enemy. This was a military operation planned with precision and executed with patience. And the Mongols had their own intelligence network. Reports started coming in to Mongol officials along the Silk Road. Unusual numbers of Persian merchants traveling east. Caravans that didn't quite make sense. Questions about routes that led to Karakorum. The Mongols were many things, but they weren't stupid. By the time the first groups of Nizari assassins reached the outskirts of Karakorum, security around Möngke Khan had tripled. New checkpoints appeared, random searches increased. Foreign visitors were watched constantly. The Nizari agents did their best. Some got close. One managed to enter the palace complex itself, disguised as a Persian scholar invited to discuss astronomical texts. He was discovered before he got within 100 yards of Möngke Khan. They were all discovered, all 400. Some were arrested. Some fought and were killed. None of them reached their target. And in Karakoram, Möngke Khan received the reports and understood exactly what had happened. The Nizari Ismailis had tried to kill him, not a general, not an administrator. Him, the great Khan, the ruler of the largest empire in human history. This was no longer just a strategic campaign to secure Persia. This was personal. Möngke sent new orders to Hulagu, destroy them all, every fortress, every warrior, every man, woman, and child who follows the Nizari faith. Spare no one, show no mercy. Make an example so complete that no one will dare challenge Mongol authority ever again. Hulagu received those orders in the spring of 1255, and he smiled, because Hulagu Khan understood something that the Nizari leadership was only beginning to grasp. The rules had changed. The old game, where assassination deterred aggression, where fear protected the weak, where a dagger in the dark balanced armies in the field, that game was over. The Mongols were playing a different game now, a game where assassination attempts didn't deter, they provoked. A game where fear worked in the opposite direction, a game where the only acceptable outcome was total annihilation. Late 1255, Hulagu's forces crossed the Oxus River and entered Persia. They didn't rush straight to Alamut. That would have been a mistake. Alamut was the most fortified position in the Nizari network. Attacking it first would cost time and lives and give the other fortresses a chance to prepare. Instead, Hulagu executed what military strategists today call peeling the onion. You don't attack the strongest point first. You start at the edges. You isolate. You divide. You create panic and confusion. And that's exactly what Hulagu did. General Kitbuka commanded the vanguard. A Nestorian Christian leading a Mongol army against Muslim fortresses. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Kitbuka's orders were clear. Attack the outlying fortresses in Quistan and Kumis, smaller fortresses, less defended, easier targets. The goal wasn't just to capture them. The goal was to send a message to every other fortress in the network. Resistance is futile. Surrender is your only option. The first fortress fell in November 1255. Kitbuka's forces surrounded it, set up trebuchets, started bombardment. The fortress held for 3 days. On the 4th day, the walls cracked. Mongol warriors poured through the breach. Everyone inside died. Warriors, families, children, no prisoners. No negotiations, no mercy. The second fortress saw what happened to the first. They surrendered immediately. Hulagu accepted their surrender, promised them safe passage, waited until they opened the gates and came out unarmed. Then he had them all executed anyway. Do you see the strategy? Do you see the psychological warfare? Resist and die. Surrender and die. There's no way out, no deal to be made, no hope. The message spread like wildfire through the Nizari network. The Mongols aren't like the Seljuks, aren't like the Abbasids, aren't like the Crusaders. Those enemies could be deterred, could be negotiated with, could be convinced that attacking Nizari fortresses was more trouble than it was worth. The Mongols couldn't be deterred, wouldn't negotiate, didn't care about trouble. They only cared about results. By December 1255, panic was setting in, and in Alamut, the Grand Master of the Nizari Ismailis, Ala al-Din Muhammad, faced a crisis he had no solution for. Ala al-Din was in his 50s. He'd led the Nizaris for 20 years. A capable administrator, a skilled diplomat, a man who understood how to navigate the complex politics of the medieval Islamic world. But he had no experience with total war. No one in the Nizari leadership did. For 166 years, their strategy had worked. Assassination, deterrence, making enemies think twice. It had worked so well that they'd forgotten what it was like to face an enemy who didn't think at all, who just acted. Ala al-Din tried to negotiate, sent envoys to Hulagu, offered tribute, offered alliance, offered anything that might stop the advance. Hulagu's response was simple. Destroy all your fortresses, surrender unconditionally, hand over all weapons, submit to Mongol authority completely, otherwise we will destroy you. Ala al-Din couldn't accept those terms. If he destroyed the fortresses, he would have nothing left. The Nizari community would be completely exposed, vulnerable to anyone who wanted to persecute them. But if he didn't accept, the war would continue, and every week another fortress fell. He was trapped between two impossible choices, and the stress was killing him, literally. December 15th, 1255. Ala al-Din Muhammad died suddenly in his chambers in Alamut. The official cause was listed as natural causes. Heart failure. He was in his 50s, the stress of the crisis. These things happen. But there were whispers. Some said they saw servants leaving his room late at night. Servants who weren't usually assigned to the Grand Master's quarters. Some said they smelled bitter almonds, the scent of certain poisons. Some said there was a faction within the Nizari leadership who believed Ala al-Din's refusal to surrender was dooming them all, that his death was necessary, that a younger leader might make better decisions. We'll never know the truth. The historical sources are unclear. Ata Malik Juvayni, the Persian historian who chronicled these events, was writing for the Mongol court. He had reasons to emphasize Nizari weakness and internal divisions. Modern historians debate whether it was assassination or simply the stress of watching everything he'd worked for collapse. But the result was clear. Ala al-Din was dead, and his son, Rukn al-Din Kursha, barely past his mid-20s, educated but untested, diplomatic but inexperienced, had to assume leadership in the worst possible circumstances. Imagine yourself in that position. Your father just died, possibly murdered by your own people. Outside, the most powerful military force in the world is systematically destroying everything you're supposed to protect. Fortresses are falling every week. Your advisors are divided. Some want to fight to the death. Some want to surrender immediately. Some want to try one more desperate assassination attempt. And everyone is looking at you, waiting for your decision. You're younger than most of your commanders. What do? Rukn al-Din did what young leaders often do when they first take power. He tried to find a middle path. He sent new envoys to Hulagu, offered more generous terms, offered to become a vassal state, pay tribute, accept Mongol overlordship, anything to preserve the fortresses and protect the community. Hulagu's response didn't change. Total surrender, destruction of all fortifications, unconditional submission, or total war. There was no middle path. The Mongols didn't believe in middle paths. Winter turned to spring, spring turned to summer. Fortresses kept falling. Kitbuka's vanguard moved methodically through Kuhistan. Each fortress isolated, each fortress given the same choice: surrender and die quickly, or resist and die slowly. Most chose to resist, out of pride, out of honor, out of hope that somehow the Mongol advance would stop. It didn't stop. By autumn 1256, more than 40 Nizari fortresses had fallen, some through siege, some through betrayal, some through simple starvation. The survivors retreated to the strongest positions. Alamut held perhaps 3,000 souls, warriors and their families. Lamasar, another 2,000. Girdku, 500. Maimundiz, where Rukn al-Din had relocated for better defensive position, held 138, all of them looking to the young Grand Master for leadership, all of them waiting for his decision. The weight of 138 lives inside Maimundiz, the weight of tens of thousands beyond its walls. October 1256. Hulagu's main army arrived at Maimundiz, the massive force that had been 2 years in the making. 12 massive trebuchets, assembled on-site by Chinese engineers who had been practicing this craft their entire lives. Supply lines stretching back hundreds of miles. Enough food and ammunition to sustain a siege for years, if necessary. Rukn al-Din stood on the walls and watched them arrive. Watch them set up camp in perfect geometric patterns. Watch them dig latrines and establish water sources and organize supply depots with military precision. Watch them assemble the trebuchets. If you've never seen a medieval trebuchet, it's hard to understand how terrifying they are. These aren't small machines. The largest ones stand 40 feet tall. The throwing arm alone is 30 feet long. The counterweight, a massive box filled with stones or sand, weighs as much as 20,000 pounds. The mathematics are precise. A counterweight of 20,000 pounds drops 12 feet. The throwing arm, a 30-foot lever, rotates around a fulcrum positioned at a ratio of 4:1 from the counterweight to the projectile. The mechanical advantage multiplies force by a factor of 10. The projectile, a 300-pound stone carefully shaped to be as dense as possible, launches at roughly 120 feet per second, arcs through the air in a parabolic trajectory calculated by engineers who understand geometry better than most scholars, falls from 100 feet up, accelerating under gravity. When it hits, the kinetic energy is approximately 400,000 foot-pounds, enough to punch through oak doors 3 feet thick, enough to crack stone walls that have stood for a century, enough to kill anyone within 15 feet of the impact point from flying debris alone. The Maimon-Diz walls were 30 feet thick at the base, solid stone blocks, each weighing several tons, mortared together, reinforced over generations with the best engineering the Ismailis possessed. The Chinese engineers calculated they needed roughly 2,000 impacts to create a breach wide enough for an assault. At 12 trebuchets operating in shifts, launching every 3 hours to allow for loading and aiming, that meant approximately 6 weeks. They had time, they had ammunition, they had patience. The math was inevitable. The bombardment started on October 8, 1256. 12 trebuchets, operating in shifts, day and night. Every few hours, a stone projectile would launch, arc through the air, and slam into the walls with a sound like thunder. The defenders on the walls would feel it through their feet. The entire fortress would shake. At first, the walls held. The stones left cracks, but nothing structural. But the bombardment didn't stop. Day after day, week after week, the cracks grew larger. The stones began to shift. Sections of wall that had stood for a century started to crumble, and inside the fortress, food supplies dwindled. Rukn al-Din had brought enough supplies for 6 months when he relocated to Maimon-Diz. That was standard procedure. Every Nizari fortress maintained at least 6 months of food storage, but he'd been there for 8 months now. The supplies were running out. He ordered half rations in early November, then quarter rations. The warriors could handle it. They'd been trained for hardship, but the children couldn't. 47 children in Maimon-Diz, ranging from infants to teenagers. They were starving. You could hear them crying at night, crying from hunger, from fear, from the constant thunder of stones hitting walls. Their mothers tried to comfort them, tried to make them understand that everything would be all right. But everything wasn't all right, and everyone knew it. November 15th, a section of the western wall collapsed. Not completely, not enough for the Mongols to breach, but enough to show that the walls weren't invincible, enough to show that time was running out. Rukn al-Din called a council meeting that night. 12 advisors, the senior military commanders, the religious leaders, the fortress administrators, 12 people crammed into a small room lit by oil lamps, listening to the distant sound of trebuchets continuing their work. The military commander spoke first. "We can hold for another month, maybe 6 weeks if we reduce rations further, but the western wall will fall before then. When it does, the Mongols will breach the fortress. We should launch a final stand. Every warrior on the walls. Make them pay for every foot they advance. Die with honor." A religious advisor disagreed. "Honor won't save the children. We should surrender. Accept Hulagu's terms. At least some might survive." Another voice, angry. "Hulagu doesn't keep his word. We've seen what happens to fortresses that surrender. They die anyway. At least if we fight, we die on our terms. The argument went on for hours. Fight or surrender. Die fast or die slow. Honor or hope. Round and round. Rukn al-Din listened, didn't speak, just listened. Finally, near midnight, he dismissed them and climbed to the eastern rampart alone. November 19th, 1256. The young grandmaster standing on fortress walls, looking down at the Mongol army below, watching the campfires, watching the stars, knowing that in 72 hours the food would be gone, knowing that the walls were cracking, knowing that every choice led to tragedy. He stood there for hours, thinking about his father, about Hassan-i-Sabah, about 166 years of history, about the library at Alamut, 400,000 books, or 40,000, or 4,000. However many there actually were, knowledge accumulated over centuries, preserved through persecution, maintained by scholars who believed that learning mattered as much as survival. What would happen to all that knowledge if the Mongols took Alamut? What would happen to the children if he chose wrong? What would happen to the Nizari community, scattered across Persia in 100 fortresses, if their Grand Master made the wrong call? He was barely past his mid-20s. He'd been a leader for less than a year, and he had to make a decision that would echo through centuries. Just before dawn, he made his choice. He walked down from the ramparts, found his senior advisor, gave his orders. Send a message to Hulagu Khan. Tell him I request a personal meeting. Tell him I'm prepared to discuss terms. The advisor stared at him. My lord, if you go to Hulagu, you may not return. Rukn al-Din nodded. I know, but if I don't go, everyone in this fortress dies for certain. If I do go, there's a chance, even a small chance. That's better than no chance. What terms will you offer? Whatever terms save the children. The message went out at dawn on November 19th. Hulagu's response came back within hours. He would meet with Rukn al-Din, but not as equals. As a conqueror meeting a defeated enemy, Rukn al-Din must come alone, unarmed, and he must order every remaining Nizari fortress to open their gates and surrender. Only then would Hulagu consider showing mercy. Consider, not promise, consider. The advisors argued against it, called it suicide, called it betrayal. Rukn al-Din listened to them all. Then he made his final decision as an independent leader. On November 19th, 1256, at noon, Rukn al-Din Kursha walked out of the gates of Maimun Diz, alone, unarmed, wearing simple white robes. He walked down the path from the fortress gate, past the defensive positions, past the points where his warriors could have held off armies. He walked through the Mongol siege lines, past warriors who watched him with curious eyes, past the trebuchets that had been hammering his fortress for weeks. He walked until he reached Hulagu Khan's command tent, and there he knelt. Some historians would later call this moment a betrayal, a coward's choice, the moment the Nizari Ismailis lost their honor. Other historians would call it the only realistic option, a desperate gamble by a young leader trying to save what he could from total disaster. The truth, as always, is more complicated. Rukn al-Din believed he was making a trade, his freedom, possibly his life, in exchange for mercy for his people. He believed that previous empires had accepted Nizari submission, that there was precedent for this, that Hulagu might be satisfied with symbolic victory rather than total annihilation. He didn't understand that the Mongols didn't think like previous empires. He didn't know that Möngke Khan's orders were absolute. He didn't know that mercy was never an option, but he made his choice based on the information he had, the hope he held, the desperation he felt. And he walked into Hulagu's tent, believing he could save his people. Hulagu Khan looked at him for a long moment, then spoke. You will order every Nizari fortress to surrender, every gate opened, every weapon surrendered. If you do this, I will consider showing mercy to those who comply immediately. Rukn al-Din nodded. And the children? The families? If the fortresses surrender quickly, they will be spared. It was a lie. But Rukn al-Din didn't know that yet. He agreed to Hulagu's terms, and from Hulagu's tent, surrounded by Mongol guards, he sent messages to every Nizari fortress still standing. "This is Rukn al-Din Kursha, your grandmaster. I order you to open your gates. Surrender to the Mongol forces. Do not resist. I have negotiated terms for our survival. Trust me. Obey me. Surrender." The messages went out to 100 fortresses across Persia. Some refused. Commanders who believed Rukn al-Din was acting under duress. Warriors who would rather die fighting than trust Mongol mercy. But most obeyed, because he was their grand master, their spiritual leader, their commander, and they trusted him. On December 15, 1256, the gates of Alamut slowly opened. The fortress that Hassan-i-Sabah had taken without a drop of blood in 1090. The fortress that had stood unconquered for 166 years, the symbol of Nizari resistance, opened its gates to the Mongol army. Hulagu's warriors entered carefully, expecting traps, expecting a final stand. They found neither. They found a fortress, stone corridors, defensive positions, supply rooms, and a library. The famous library of Alamut. Ata Malik Juvaini, the Persian historian serving in Hulagu's court, was given permission to enter the library before its destruction. He described what he saw in his chronicle. Thousands of volumes, manuscripts on astronomy, mathematics, philosophy, medicine, commentaries on the Quran, Ismaili theological texts, translations of Greek philosophy, Persian poetry. Juvaini was allowed to select what to save. He chose copies of the Quran, some astronomical texts that he deemed scientifically valuable, a few Ismaili religious works for the historical record. Everything else was to be burned. Juvaini tried to argue, tried to explain that some of these texts existed nowhere else, that burning them would erase knowledge that could never be recovered. The Mongol commander wasn't interested. Orders were orders. On December 20th, 1256, they set the library on fire. We'll never know exactly how many books burned that day. The sources say 400,000 volumes. Modern historians think that's an exaggeration. Maybe 40,000 is more realistic. But even if it was only 4,000 books, think about what that means. 4,000 manuscripts, hand-copied, irreplaceable, containing knowledge accumulated over centuries, scientific observations, mathematical proofs, philosophical arguments, poetry and history and medicine. Gone, turned to ash in a few hours. Somewhere in those flames might have been the cure for diseases we still struggle with, might have been mathematical insights that would take centuries to rediscover, might have been poetry that would have moved generations. We'll never know, because the Mongols didn't value what they destroyed. They only valued obedience, and the Nizari Ismailis had dared to disobey. Meanwhile, Rukn al-Din waited in Hulagu's camp, waited to hear if his gamble had worked, waited to learn if surrendering his freedom had saved his people. He was about to discover that he had made a terrible mistake. Rukn al-Din waited in Hulagu's camp for 3 weeks. Not as a prisoner, exactly, not locked in chains or thrown in a cell, but not as a free man either. He was assigned a tent, given food, treated with a sort of cold courtesy that the Mongols reserved for defeated enemies who had surrendered peacefully. But he wasn't allowed to leave. And every day he waited for news from the fortresses, news about whether his people had obeyed his orders, news about whether Hulagu would keep his promise of mercy. The news came in slowly, messengers arriving from different parts of Persia, reports being delivered to Hulagu's command tent. Rukn al-Din wasn't invited to hear these reports, but he could see the messengers coming and going, could see the Mongol officers gathering for briefings, and he could see on their faces satisfaction. By early January 1257, the news was complete. 96 Nizari fortresses had surrendered. 96 fortresses had opened their gates, laid down their weapons, and submitted to Mongol authority, just as Rukn al-Din had ordered. 4 fortresses refused. Their commanders didn't trust the Mongols, didn't trust the young leader's judgment, chose to hold out. Lamasar, Girdku, and 2 smaller fortresses in the mountains of Kohistan. But 96 out of 100 had obeyed, tens of thousands of people, warriors and their families, old men and women, children, all waiting to learn if Rukn al-Din's gamble had worked, waiting to learn if surrender meant survival. In mid-January, Rukn al-Din requested an audience with Hulagu. The request was granted. He entered Hulagu's tent and bowed low. The protocol for a vassal meeting, his overlord. "The fortresses have surrendered, my lord, as you commanded. 96 fortresses have opened their gates. My people have laid down their weapons. We are yours to command." Hulagu nodded, said nothing. Rukn al-Din continued, "I ask permission to travel to Karakoram to meet with the great Khan, Monke, to formally submit and negotiate the terms of our vassalage." This was the standard procedure in Mongol governance. When a region surrendered, its leaders traveled to the capital to pay homage to the great Khan, to acknowledge his supremacy, to receive their official position as vassals. Rukn al-Din believed this was what would happen now, that he would travel to Karakoram, meet Monke, establish the Nizari Ismailis as a subject people under Mongol protection. It wasn't independence, it wasn't freedom, but it was survival. Hulagu considered the request for a long moment, then nodded. "You may go to Karakoram. Take a small entourage. 10 men. No weapons. My guards will escort you." Rukn al-Din bowed again, feeling something like hope for the first time in months. "Thank you, my lord. And the people in the fortresses? Those who surrendered? They will remain where they are until we receive word from Karakoram." It wasn't the reassurance Rukn al-Din wanted, but it wasn't a death sentence either. He left the tent believing he had succeeded, believing that his surrender had saved his people. He was wrong. The journey from Persia to Karakoram is roughly 3,000 miles, through mountains and deserts and steppes. Even with Mongol logistics, even with fresh horses at regular intervals, it takes months. Rukn al-Din and his small entourage departed in late January 1257. 10 companions, all loyal, all hopeful that this journey would secure their people's future. 50 Mongol guards, officially to protect them, actually to watch them. They traveled the Silk Road eastward, through cities Rukn al-Din had never seen, past landscapes that should have been beautiful but felt oppressive. Because the entire journey, Rukn al-Din felt a growing unease. The Mongol guards were polite, professional, but cold. They didn't speak to the Nizari group unless necessary, didn't answer questions, didn't engage in the sort of casual conversation that makes long journeys bearable. They were efficient, distant, like men escorting prisoners to execution rather than diplomats to negotiation. Rukn al-Din tried to push the feeling away, tried to tell himself it was just Mongol military discipline, but the unease grew. They reached Karakoram in early June 1257, 5 months of travel. The Mongol capital was impressive, larger than Rukn al-Din expected, more organized, a city built for administration and power. They were taken to a compound near the palace, given comfortable quarters, told to wait while arrangements were made for their audience with Monke Khan. They waited 3 days. Then a Mongol official arrived with a message. "The great Khan will not see you." Rukn al-Din felt his stomach drop. "Why? I surrendered as commanded. I ordered all fortresses to open their gates. What more does he require?" The official's face was expressionless. 4 fortresses have not surrendered. Lamasar, Girdku, 2 others in Kohistan. The agreement is not complete until all fortresses submit. But I have no control over those fortresses. Their commanders refused my orders. I cannot force them to surrender. Nevertheless, the great Khan will not meet with you until all fortresses surrender. You will return to Persia. When the last fortress falls, you may request another audience. It was a death sentence disguised as bureaucracy, because everyone in that room understood what return to Persia meant. Rukn al-Din would never reach Persia. He looked at the Mongol official, tried to read something in that blank face. Some hint of mercy, some possibility of appeal, nothing. "We depart tomorrow," the official said, and left. That night, Rukn al-Din sat with his 10 companions in their quarters. They knew. They all knew. One of them, a young warrior named Hassan, spoke quietly. "We could run tonight, disappear into the city." Rukn al-Din shook his head. 50 guards surround this compound. We're 3,000 miles from home. We wouldn't make it a mile. Then we fight, take some of them with us. And prove that the Mongols were right not to trust us? No, we surrendered. We gave our word. We'll face whatever comes with dignity. Another companion, older, asked the question they were all thinking. Was it worth it? The surrender? Did we save anyone? Rukn al-Din didn't answer for a long time. Finally he said, "I don't know yet, but I believed it was the right choice. I still believe it." He wasn't sure if that was true, but he said it anyway. They departed Karakorum the next morning, heading west, back toward Persia. The 50 Mongol guards rode with them, silent, professional. They traveled for 3 weeks. And then, one morning, in a valley somewhere in Central Asia, far from any city, far from any witness, the Mongol captain gave an order. The guards surrounded Rukn al-Din and his companions. No weapons were drawn, not yet. The captain spoke. "By order of Möngke Khan, great Khan of the Mongol Empire, Rukn al-Din Kursha and his companions are sentenced to death for crimes against the empire." Rukn al-Din didn't ask what crimes, didn't beg for mercy, didn't try to argue. He simply said, "My people, the ones who surrendered, will they be spared?" The captain didn't answer. The execution was carried out according to Mongol tradition for defeated rulers. No blood was spilled. Blood was considered sacred in Mongol culture. Spilling the blood of a leader, even a defeated one, was disrespectful. Instead, they used a different method. Rukn al-Din and his 10 companions were wrapped in carpets, bound tightly, unable to move. Then horses were ridden back and forth over them, trampled to death, bones crushed, internal injuries fatal but leaving no visible wounds. It took less than 10 minutes. Rukn al-Din Kursha, barely past his mid-20s, Grand Master of the Nizari Ismailis for barely 1 year, died in an unmarked valley 3,000 miles from home, believing, perhaps hoping, that his death had purchased safety for his people. He was wrong. The order came from Möngke Khan shortly after Rukn al-Din's execution. A single sentence, clear, absolute. Eliminate all Nizari Ismailis in Persia. Spare no one. Not just the warriors, not just the fortress garrisons, everyone. The systematic massacre began in July 1257. Hulagu's forces moved through Persia methodically, city by city, fortress by fortress, community by community. The 96 fortresses that had surrendered peacefully, their people were summoned to assembly points, told they would receive new assignments, new lands to settle. They came unarmed, trusting, believing that surrender had saved them. In Kohistan, 12,000 people gathered in a valley outside their fortress. Men, women, children. 3 generations of families, Mongol soldiers surrounded the valley, and then, on a signal, they attacked. 12,000 people, slaughtered in a single afternoon. The killing was efficient, organized. Soldiers working in shifts so they didn't tire. When it was done, the bodies were left where they fell. A message to anyone who might think about resisting Mongol authority in the future. This is what happens to those who oppose us. This is what happens even to those who surrender. The massacres continued throughout the summer and autumn of 1257. Ata Malik Juvaini, the Persian historian, recorded the numbers as best he could. He estimated more than 100,000 Nizari Ismailis were killed in Persia between July and December 1257. Modern historians debate that number. Some think it's exaggerated. Some think it might be low, but everyone agrees this was one of the most systematic massacres in medieval history. Not a battle, not a siege, a deliberate, organized campaign to eliminate an entire community. Not just in Persia, but in Syria too, where Nizari communities had also existed for decades. The Mongols sent word to their allies in Syria. The same policy applied. Find the Nizari Ismailis. Kill them all. But 4 fortresses didn't surrender. Lamasar, Girdku, 2 others in Kohistan. Their commanders had refused Rukn al-Din's orders, had chosen to hold out. At the time, many considered them traitors, fools, throwing away the chance for survival that their leader had negotiated. But those commanders understood something the young Grand Master didn't. The Mongols didn't negotiate, didn't keep promises, didn't believe in mercy. Surrender meant death. Resistance meant death. At least resistance meant death on your own terms. Lamasar held out until January 1257, not because of military strength, because of disease. A cholera outbreak swept through the fortress, killed half the garrison, weakened the rest. When the Mongols finally breached the walls, there were barely enough defenders left to put up a fight. Those who survived the disease were executed. The 2 small fortresses in Kohistan fell within months of each other. One by siege, one by treachery when a defender opened the gates in exchange for promised mercy. He was executed along with everyone else. That left one, Girdku, a fortress built on a mountain peak in northern Persia. Not as large as Alamut, not as famous, but just as defensible. And commanded by a man who absolutely refused to surrender. His name was lost to history. We don't know who led Girdku's defense, but we know what he did. He held out for 13 years. 13 years. The Mongol forces besieged Girdku in 1257, set up their trebuchets, started bombardment. The fortress held. They tried assault. Sent warriors up the narrow mountain paths. The defenders held. They tried starvation, surrounded the fortress, cut off all supplies. The fortress had underground springs, storage rooms carved into the mountain itself. They held. Year after year after year. By 1260, the Mongol Empire had moved on to other conquests. Hulagu was fighting in Syria. Möngke Khan had died. The empire was dealing with succession crises, but they left a small force at Girdku, a reminder, a symbol. This fortress will fall, eventually. And in 1270, 13 years after the siege began, it finally did. Not through military defeat, through simple attrition. The defenders were old, tired, running out of everything except stubbornness. The last commander of Girdku negotiated surrender terms. The Mongols, perhaps impressed by 13 years of resistance, perhaps simply tired of the siege, allowed the surviving defenders to leave. 47 people walked out of Girdku Fortress in 1270. 47 people out of the hundreds who had been there at the start. They were allowed to live. Scattered to different regions, forbidden from gathering together, forbidden from practicing their faith openly. But they lived, and with them, the ember of Nizari Ismaili survival remained. Now, let's jump forward 5 years, to 1275, 18 years after Alamut fell. A man appeared in northern Persia, young, maybe 20 years old, claiming to be the son of Rukn al-Din Kursha. No one knew if it was true. Rukn al-Din had died without clear heirs. This young man might have been his son, might have been an impostor, might have been someone who simply saw an opportunity. But he gathered followers. Nizari Ismaili, who had survived the massacres by hiding, by converting publicly while maintaining their faith privately, by scattering to remote villages where Mongol authority was weak. They rallied to this young man. And in the summer of 1275, they did something impossible. They recaptured Alamut, not through military force. The fortress was lightly garrisoned now. The Mongols considered the Nizari threat eliminated. They'd left only a skeleton crew. The attack came at night, swift, coordinated. The Mongol garrison was overwhelmed in hours, and for a few brief months, the flag of the Nizari Ismailis flew over Alamut once again. It didn't last. The Mongols couldn't allow it. Not after everything they'd done to destroy the Nizaris. They sent an army, not as large as Hulagu's original force, but large enough. The siege lasted 6 weeks. This time, the defenders knew there would be no negotiation, no surrender, no mercy. When the Mongols breached the walls, the defenders fought to the last man, including the young man who claimed to be Rukn al-Din's son. He died on the walls of Alamut, sword in hand, surrounded by enemies. But his message echoed through history, even after catastrophe, even after massacre, even after everything is destroyed. The spirit doesn't die. Fast forward 750 years to the present day. The Nizari Ismaili community still exists, roughly 15 million people worldwide, scattered across more than 25 countries: Pakistan, India, Syria, East Africa, Europe, North America. Their spiritual leader is the Aga Khan, currently Aga Khan IV, the 49th Imam in direct descent from Muhammad according to Ismaili theology. 49 generations. Think about that. 49 generations of continuous leadership, through persecution, through massacre, through centuries of survival in the shadows. The Nizari Ismailis today don't practice assassination, don't build mountain fortresses, don't train Fidayeen warriors. They build hospitals, schools, universities. The Aga Khan Development Network operates in 30 countries, providing health care to millions, education to hundreds of thousands, economic development to impoverished communities, from assassination to development, from violence to service, from fear to hope. That's the transformation. That's the legacy, not the fortresses, not the assassinations, not the military resistance, the survival, the adaptation, the refusal to disappear. So what do we learn from this story? What lessons carry across 770 years? First lesson: no strategy is invincible forever. The Nizari Ismaili approach worked brilliantly for 166 years. Asymmetric warfare, assassination as deterrence, making persecution too costly to be worth it. It worked against the Seljuks, against the Abbasids, against the Crusaders, against every conventional empire, but it didn't work against the Mongols. Because the Mongols weren't a conventional empire, they didn't think like previous enemies. They didn't calculate cost versus benefit the same way. The world changes. What works today might not work tomorrow. The fortress that seems impregnable can fall. The strategy that seems brilliant can become obsolete. Adaptation isn't optional. It's survival. Second lesson: leadership means impossible choices. Rukn al-Din was barely past his mid-20s, inexperienced. Thrust into leadership at the worst possible moment, he had to choose between fighting to the death, honorable but guaranteeing total annihilation, or surrendering with the slim hope of saving some lives. Neither choice was good. Both led to tragedy. But he made the choice he thought would save the most people, based on the information he had, based on historical precedent, based on desperate hope. We can judge him from 700 years later, from comfortable positions, with all the information about what happened next. But he didn't have that information. He only had impossible choices and very little time. Before you judge historical figures, ask yourself, what would I have done? Be honest with yourself. Third lesson: survival sometimes means transformation. The Nizari Ismaili survived, but not through military resistance, not through maintaining their fortresses, not through continuing their assassination strategy. They survived by adapting, by going underground, by preserving their identity in private while appearing to conform in public, by waiting generations for circumstances to change. And when they could finally emerge again, they emerged different, not warriors, not assassins, builders, educators, developers. Sometimes survival means changing form to preserve essence. Sometimes bending is stronger than breaking. Fourth lesson, even total defeat isn't final. In 1257, the Nizari Ismailis were finished. Fortresses destroyed, leaders executed, hundreds of thousands massacred. Any reasonable observer would have said, they're gone, eliminated, erased from history. But 18 years later, they recaptured Alamut, even if only briefly, even if only symbolically. And 750 years later, 15 million of them exist worldwide. Total defeat in the short term, victory in the long term. History isn't written in years, it's written in centuries. Fifth lesson, what seems permanent is temporary. The Mongol Empire seemed invincible in 1257, the largest land empire in human history, the most efficient military machine ever created. Where is it now? Gone, fragmented. Dissolved into successor states that themselves rose and fell, the fortresses of Alamut are ruins, tourist destinations, historical curiosities. But the community they were built to protect, still here. The walls fell, the people survived. Because in the end, walls are just stone. They crack, they crumble, they fall. But ideas, beliefs, communities, those are harder to destroy. They can survive in the shadows, in whispered prayers, in stories passed from grandparent to grandchild. They can wait for generations if necessary. And when the time is right, they can emerge again. The ruins of Alamut still stand in the Alborz Mountains of northern Iran. You can visit them if you want. Tourists do. Hikers climb the path that Mongol warriors once assaulted, stand on the walls where Rukn al-Din stood, look down at the valley where Hulagu's army camped. The fortress is empty now, crumbling, reclaimed by weather and time. But if you stand there quietly, if you let yourself imagine, you can almost hear the echoes, the sound of stones launched from trebuchets, the cries of children hungry in the siege, the quiet voice of a young leader trying to decide between terrible choices, the crackle of flames consuming hundreds of thousands of books, the last defiant shout from defenders at Gurdku after 13 years of resistance, the whispered prayers of survivors maintaining their faith in secret for generations, all of it echoing through 770 years, reminding us that history isn't just about what happened, it's about what it means. And the story of Rukn al-Din and the Nizari Ismailis means this: power is temporary, violence is temporary. Even empire is temporary, but the human capacity for survival, for adaptation, for resilience, for preserving identity through impossible circumstances, that's permanent. That endures, that wins, not in years, maybe not in lifetimes, but in centuries, in the long arc of history. The fortress falls, the empire crumbles, the walls turn to dust, but the people survive, and that's the victory that matters. So we return to the question we asked at the beginning. If you were Rukn al-Din, barely past your mid-20s, standing on those walls, looking down at the Mongol army, responsible for 138 lives inside the fortress, 100,000 more in fortresses across Persia. If every choice led to tragedy, what would you do? There's no right answer. There never was. But the question matters, because it's not just about Rukn al-Din, it's about leadership, about impossible choices, about doing your best when there are no good options. It's about being human in circumstances that test the limits of humanity. Rukn al-Din made his choice. It didn't save his people in the short term, but maybe, in ways he never knew, in ways that took centuries to manifest, it did save them, because they're still here, 15 million strong, building instead of destroying, healing instead of killing, surviving instead of disappearing. And maybe that's the legacy the young Grand Master would have wanted. Not the fortresses, not the military resistance, not even the library, the survival, the continuation, the refusal to be erased, The fortress fell. The people endured. And 770 years later, we're still telling their story. That's victory. That's legacy. That's what matters in the end.